In the gentle mists of time, where legend meets the first whispers of history, 7 hills rise from the banks of the Tiber River. The year is 753 before the Common Era, and on these rolling slopes, destiny stirs in the morning light. Here, according to the tales passed down through countless generations, twin brothers named Romulus and Remus were suckled by a she-wolf, their cries echoing across what would one day become the eternal city. The story flows like a river through time, carrying with it the dreams of shepherds who would become kings, and kings who would build an empire that stretched from the misty shores of Britain to the sun-baked sands of Egypt. As you settle into the rhythm of this ancient tale, let your mind wander back to those earliest days when Rome was nothing more than a collection of mud brick huts and wooden palisades. The Latins, a pastoral people with calloused hands and weathered faces, tended their flocks on these 7 hills, while the Etruscans to the north built their sophisticated cities with drainage systems and painted tombs. To the south, Greek colonies dotted the coastline like scattered jewels, bringing with them the wisdom of philosophy and the beauty of marble sculpture. Between these great civilizations, on the marshy ground beside the Tiber's bend, something new was beginning to take shape. The foundation myth speaks of divine intervention and brotherly strife, of Romulus drawing his furrow in the earth to mark the sacred boundary of his new city, and of Remus leaping over that boundary in mockery, only to fall dead by his brother's hand. Whether these events occurred as the poets sang them, or whether they represent something deeper about the Roman character, the truth remains that by the 8th century before our era, small settlements had indeed begun to coalesce on the Palatine and other hills. Archaeological evidence whispers of simple burials and pottery shards, of the gradual draining of swampland, and the construction of the first crude temples to gods whose names would one day thunder across 3 continents. These early Romans lived in a world where the sacred and the practical intertwined like ivy around an oak tree. Every action required the approval of the gods, every decision demanded an augury or the examination of sacrificial entrails. The first kings, whether Romulus truly existed or whether he represents a composite of several early rulers, established the fundamental institutions that would endure for centuries. The Senate, that august body of elder statesmen, began as a council of tribal elders whose wisdom guided the king's decisions. The army, which would one day march in disciplined ranks across the known world, started as bands of citizen farmers who could be called to defend their homes and families. As the decades passed and the first century of Roman existence drew to a close, the city on the 7 hills began to expand its influence over the surrounding countryside. The Latin tribes, recognizing common interests and shared dangers, formed leagues and alliances. Trade routes developed along the Tiber, bringing amber from the distant Baltic, silk from far Cathay, and spices from the mysterious lands beyond the Red Sea. The Romans, with their practical minds and gift for organization, became the middlemen in this ancient commerce, growing wealthy and powerful while never losing their fundamental character as warriors and farmers. The second king of Rome, according to tradition, was Numa Pompilius, a figure shrouded in the gentle wisdom of legend. Unlike the war-loving Romulus, Numa was said to be a man of peace, devoted to the establishment of religious law and sacred ritual. During his long reign, the Romans learned to honor not only Mars, the god of war, but also Vesta, keeper of the sacred flame, and Janus, the two-faced god who watched over beginnings and endings. Under Numa's guidance, the calendar was reformed, the priesthood organized, and the legal foundations laid that would support the mighty edifice of Roman law. As you drift deeper into this story, imagine the soft chanting of priests at dawn, the smoke of incense rising from marble altars, and the careful recording of omens and portents that would guide the destiny of nations. The early monarchy continued with kings whose names have echoed through the corridors of time. Tullus Hostilius, the warlike king who conquered the neighbouring city of Alba Longa and forcibly relocated its population to Rome, thereby doubling the city's size and establishing the precedent for the integration of conquered peoples. Ancus Marcius, who built the first bridge across the Tiber and established the port of Ostia at the river's mouth, opening Rome to the commerce of the Mediterranean world. These rulers, whether historical figures or legendary archetypes, represented the dual nature of early Rome, a people simultaneously devoted to the gods and to conquest, to tradition and to pragmatic innovation. The transformation of Rome from a small Italian city-state to a regional power accelerated under the Etruscan kings who ruled during the 6th century before our era. Lucius Tarquinius Priscus, the first of these foreign rulers, brought with him the sophisticated urban planning and engineering expertise of Etruscan civilization. Under his guidance, the Romans learned to build with stone rather than mud brick, to create sewers and aqueducts, and to construct the great Circus Maximus, where hundreds of thousands would one day gather to watch the thundering of chariot wheels and the clash of gladiatorial combat. Servius Tullius, the 6th king, undertook reforms that would reshape Roman society for centuries to come. He organized the citizen body according to wealth rather than birth, creating the centuriate system that would form the backbone of both the Roman army and the Roman political system. Every citizen was assigned to a class based on his ability to equip himself for war, from the wealthy equites who could afford horses and armour, down to the proletarii, whose only contribution to the state was their children. This system, while maintaining aristocratic privilege, created pathways for social mobility that would allow Rome to absorb and integrate peoples from across the known world. The last king, Tarquinius Superbus, earned his epithet the Proud through his arrogance and tyranny. His reign, marked by grand construction projects including the Temple of Jupiter, Optimus Maximus on the Capitoline Hill, ended in violence and revolution when his son Sextus Tarquinius committed an act of rape against Lucretia, a virtuous Roman matron. Her suicide in shame, and the oath sworn by her kinsmen to drive out the kings forever, marked the end of the Roman monarchy and the beginning of the Republic. As the night continues and this ancient tale unfolds, we arrive at one of the great turning points in human history. The year 509 before our era witnessed the establishment of the Roman Republic, a form of government that would endure for nearly 5 centuries and provide the model for countless nations yet unborn. The Romans, having thrown off the yoke of monarchy, created a system of shared power that balanced the interests of the aristocratic patricians with those of the common plebeians. 2 consuls, elected annually, shared the executive power that had once belonged to kings. The Senate, expanded and formalized, became the guiding voice of Roman policy. And the various assemblies of citizens provided a forum for debate and decision-making that, while limited by class distinctions, represented a remarkable experiment in popular government. The early republic faced immediate challenges that tested the strength of its new institutions. The Etruscan king Lars Porsena marched on Rome, seeking to restore Tarquinius Superbus to his throne. According to legend, the city was saved by heroes whose names became synonymous with Roman virtue. Horatius Cocles, who single-handedly held the bridge against Porsena's army, while his comrades destroyed it behind him. Mucius Scaevola, who thrust his right hand into the fire to demonstrate Roman determination. And Cloelia, who led a group of hostages in a daring escape across the Tiber. Whether these figures existed as described or represent the collective courage of the early Romans, their stories illustrate the values that would sustain the Republic through centuries of triumph and trial. The class struggle between patricians and plebeians, known as the conflict of the orders, dominated the first 2 centuries of the Republic. The patricians, claiming descent from the original followers of Romulus, monopolized political and religious offices, while the plebeians, who formed the majority of the population, demanded equal rights and representation. This conflict, unlike similar struggles in other ancient states, was resolved through compromise rather than revolution. The plebeians gained their own tribunes, magistrates with the power to veto actions harmful to the common people. They won the right to intermarry with patricians, to hold high office, and to have the laws written down and published, creating the 12 tables that formed the foundation of Roman jurisprudence. As these internal struggles gradually resolved themselves, Rome turned its attention outward to the conquest of Italy. The process was neither swift nor easy, requiring nearly 3 centuries of almost constant warfare. The Romans fought the Aequi and Volsci in the hills to the east and south, the Veientes and other Etruscan cities to the north, and eventually the Samnites, a confederation of hardy mountain peoples who proved to be Rome's most dangerous enemies in peninsular Italy. Each victory brought not only territory and tribute, but also new citizens, for Rome's genius lay in its willingness to extend citizenship, full or limited, to conquered peoples who proved their loyalty and adopted Roman ways. The capture of Veii in 396 before our era, after a 10-year siege that Romans compared to the legendary siege of Troy, marked Rome's emergence as the dominant power in central Italy. The victory came at a tremendous cost in blood and treasure, but it demonstrated Rome's capacity for sustained effort and strategic thinking. The Romans had learned to conduct siege warfare, to maintain armies in the field for extended periods, and to coordinate the efforts of multiple legions across vast territories. More importantly, they had shown that they could absorb temporary defeats without losing sight of their ultimate objectives. The sack of Rome by Gallic tribes in 390 before our era provided a harsh lesson in the realities of ancient warfare. The Gauls, tall, fair-haired warriors from beyond the Alps, swept down through Etruria like a winter storm, defeating a Roman army at the Allia River and occupying the city itself. Only the Capitoline Hill held out, defended by a small garrison that, according to legend, was alerted to a night attack by the cackling of sacred geese. The Romans eventually ransomed their city with gold, but the humiliation burned in their collective memory and drove them to rebuild their walls, reorganize their army, and never again allow foreign enemies to threaten their heartland. The long wars with the Samnites, fought in 3 phases over nearly 70 years, tested Roman endurance and adaptability to their utmost limits. The Samnites, dwelling in the rugged Apennine Mountains, were natural guerrilla fighters who understood how to use terrain to their advantage. They inflicted several serious defeats on Roman armies, most memorably at the Caudine Forks, where they forced an entire Roman army to pass under the yoke in symbolic submission. Yet Rome's federal system, which bound allies to her cause through treaties rather than mere conquest, proved more resilient than Samnite independence. Year after year, Roman armies returned to the attack, supported by Latin and other Italian allies who had thrown in their lot with the rising power. As you allow yourself to drift deeper into this flowing narrative of ancient struggles and triumphs, consider the transformation that was occurring within Roman society itself. The city on the 7 hills was becoming something unprecedented in the ancient world, a multinational state that could absorb peoples of different languages, customs, and traditions while maintaining its essential character. Greeks from the southern Italian colonies brought their philosophy and literature. Etruscans contributed their expertise in engineering and religious ritual. Gauls and Germans added their martial prowess. And from across the Mediterranean came merchants, artisans, and slaves who enriched Roman culture while being enriched by it. The final conquest of peninsular Italy came with Rome's victory over Pyrrhus of Epirus, a Hellenistic king who intervened in Italian affairs at the invitation of the Greek city of Tarentum. Pyrrhus, a skilled general and kinsman of Alexander the Great, won several tactical victories over Roman armies, but found himself unable to break Roman resolve or detach Rome's allies from their loyalty. His Pyrrhic victories, bought at such a high cost in casualties that they weakened rather than strengthened his position, demonstrated both the quality of Hellenistic military professionalism and the superior strategic resources that Rome could bring to bear in a prolonged conflict. When Pyrrhus finally abandoned Italy in 275 before our era, Rome stood unchallenged as master of the peninsula from the Po Valley to the Straits of Messina. The conquest of Italy brought Rome face to face with Carthage, the great Phoenician trading empire that controlled much of the western Mediterranean. Carthage, founded by colonists from Tyre centuries earlier, had grown rich and powerful through commerce rather than conquest. Her ships carried goods from Britain's tin mines to India's spice markets, and her merchants counted their wealth in talents of silver and gold rather than in the acres of farmland that measured Roman prosperity. The two powers had coexisted peacefully for centuries, but the logic of expansion and the ambitions of their respective ruling classes made conflict inevitable. The First Punic War, fought primarily at sea and in Sicily between 264 and 241 before our era, transformed Rome from a land power into a maritime empire. The Romans, with characteristic pragmatism, built their first serious navy by copying a captured Carthaginian ship and training their crews on dry land before launching them into battle. The war dragged on for more than 20 years, consuming the resources and manpower of both sides, while the beautiful island of Sicily served as the primary battleground. Roman persistence eventually prevailed, and Carthage was forced to abandon Sicily and pay a heavy indemnity, but the cost in blood and treasure foreshadowed even greater struggles to come. The interval between the First and Second Punic Wars saw Rome consolidating her control over newly acquired territories, while Carthage sought to rebuild her strength in Spain. The Barca family, led by Hamilcar and later by his son Hannibal, carved out a new Carthaginian empire among the silver mines and warrior tribes of Iberia. These years of relative peace allowed both powers to develop the resources and strategies that would make their next confrontation one of the most dramatic conflicts in human history. Hannibal's crossing of the Alps in 218 before our era, leading an army of Africans, Spaniards, and war elephants through the treacherous mountain passes to strike at Rome's heartland, ranks among the greatest military achievements of all time. The young Carthaginian general, sworn from childhood to eternal hatred of Rome, understood that his only hope of victory lay in destroying the Roman Confederation by defeating Roman armies so decisively that Rome's Italian allies would abandon their loyalty and join his cause. His tactical genius was demonstrated in a series of crushing victories at the Trebia River, where he used the terrain and weather to his advantage, at Lake Trasimene, where he laid a perfect ambush that destroyed an entire Roman army, and most spectacularly at Cannae, where his double envelopment maneuver annihilated the largest army Rome had ever fielded. As the night deepens around you and this ancient drama unfolds, imagine the terror that gripped Rome after Cannae. Hannibal stood at the gates of the Eternal City with a victorious army, and many expected him to complete his triumph by storming the walls and burning the temples. Yet Rome's strength lay not in her walls, but in her people and their allies, most of whom remained loyal despite the disasters that had befallen Roman arms. The Romans appointed Quintus Fabius Maximus as dictator, a man whose strategy of avoiding pitched battles while harassing Hannibal's army earned him the nickname Cunctator, the delayer. This patient, unglamorous approach gradually wore down Carthaginian strength, while Rome rebuilt her armies and maintained pressure on Carthaginian territories in Spain and Africa. The Roman recovery began with the emergence of Publius Cornelius Scipio, later called Africanus, a young general who understood that Rome could not win the war by remaining on the defensive. Scipio's campaigns in Spain demonstrated a new kind of Roman generalship, combining tactical flexibility with strategic vision. He captured New Carthage in a brilliant assault, defeated Carthaginian armies through superior training and discipline, and gradually expelled Carthaginian forces from the Iberian Peninsula. His success in Spain provided Rome with the resources and confidence needed to carry the war to Africa itself. The final act of the Second Punic War played out on the plains near Zama in 202 before our era, where Scipio faced Hannibal in a battle that would determine the fate of the Western Mediterranean. Both generals deployed their finest soldiers and most sophisticated tactics, but Roman superiority in cavalry, provided by Numidian allies who had switched sides, proved decisive. Hannibal's defeat at Zama ended Carthage's dreams of empire and established Rome as the dominant power in the Western Mediterranean. The peace terms stripped Carthage of her navy, her overseas territories, and her independence in foreign affairs, reducing the once mighty trading empire to a wealthy but powerless city-state. The victory over Carthage opened the Mediterranean world to Roman expansion, but it also exposed Rome to new challenges and temptations. The Hellenistic kingdoms of the East, heirs to Alexander the Great's conquests, possessed vast wealth, sophisticated culture, and military traditions that both attracted and threatened the Romans. Philip V of Macedon had allied himself with Hannibal during the darkest days of the Second Punic War, providing Rome with a justification for intervention in Greek affairs. The subsequent wars in Greece and Asia Minor brought Roman legions face to face with the phalanxes of Alexander's successors and the war elephants of Eastern potentates. The defeat of Philip V at Cynocephalae in 197 before our era demonstrated the superiority of the Roman manipular system over the rigid Macedonian phalanx in broken terrain. The Roman general Titus Quinctius Flamininus, combining military skill with diplomatic finesse, proclaimed the freedom of the Greek cities at the Isthmian Games, earning thunderous applause from crowds that had expected continued subjugation. Yet this proclaimed freedom was qualified by Roman oversight, and the Greeks soon learned that their liberty existed only at Roman sufferance. The war against Antiochus III of Syria, the most powerful of the Hellenistic monarchs, brought Roman armies into Asia for the first time. Antiochus, called the Great for his conquests in the Far East, commanded resources that dwarfed those available to any Western power. His army included not only the traditional phalanx of Macedonian settlers, but also war elephants from India, cataphract cavalry from Persia, and mercenaries from a dozen different nations. Yet when the decisive battle was fought at Magnesia in 190 before our era, Roman discipline and tactical flexibility again proved superior to Eastern magnificence. The defeat of Antiochus established Roman hegemony over the Eastern Mediterranean and brought vast wealth flowing into Roman coffers. As you drift further into this tale of conquest and empire, consider how these victories changed Rome itself. The simple farmer soldiers who had defended their city against Hannibal were becoming professional warriors who served for decades in distant lands. The wealth of the Mediterranean world flowed through Roman hands, enriching some citizens beyond their wildest dreams, while leaving others behind in relative poverty. Greek philosophy, art, and literature began to influence Roman culture, creating tensions between traditional values and sophisticated new ideas. Slaves from conquered territories worked Roman farms and built Roman monuments, while their former masters served as tutors and secretaries in Roman households. The Third Punic War, fought between 149 and 146 before our era, revealed both Rome's overwhelming power and the darker aspects of Roman character that would shadow the empire's later history. Carthage, reduced to a shadow of her former self but still wealthy from African trade, became the target of Roman fears and jealousies, embodied in the famous words of Cato the Elder: "Carthage must be destroyed." The war was a foregone conclusion from the beginning, but the final siege of Carthage lasted 3 years and ended with the complete destruction of the city and the enslavement of its population. The Romans sowed salt in the ruins and forbade any future settlement on the site, creating a desert where one of the world's great cities had stood for 6 centuries. The same year that saw the destruction of Carthage also witnessed the sack of Corinth, the wealthy commercial centre of Greece. Like Carthage, Corinth had posed no real threat to Roman power, but her destruction served as a warning to any who might challenge Roman dominance. The systematic looting of Greek art treasures and the sale of the population into slavery demonstrated that Roman clemency had limits, and that those limits were determined by Roman interests rather than by any universal standard of justice. By the middle of the 2nd century before our era, Rome had become the unquestioned master of the Mediterranean world. But this mastery came at a price that would ultimately prove ruinous. The vast influx of wealth disrupted traditional Roman society, creating a class of super-rich nobles while impoverishing the small farmers who had once formed the backbone of the Roman army. Slave labour from conquered territories made free labour economically unviable in many regions, forcing displaced Romans to crowd into the city, where they became dependent on government subsidies and public entertainment. The prolonged military campaigns that brought Rome her empire also professionalised her army, creating a force of career soldiers whose loyalty was to their commanders rather than to the state. The crisis of the Roman Republic began with the attempts of the Gracchi brothers to address the growing inequality and social tensions within Roman society. Tiberius Gracchus, elected tribune of the plebs in 133 before our era, proposed to redistribute public land to landless citizens, thereby rebuilding the class of small farmers that had once been Rome's strength. His brother Gaius, serving as tribune a decade later, attempted to extend these reforms while also addressing the grievances of Rome's Italian allies, who had fought loyally for Rome for centuries without receiving the full benefits of citizenship. Both brothers died violently, victims of political opposition that increasingly turned to force rather than persuasion. Their deaths marked the beginning of a century of civil strife that would ultimately destroy the republic they had tried to save. The precedent of using violence to resolve political disputes, once established, proved impossible to contain. Senators armed themselves with daggers, magistrates hired bodyguards, and the streets of Rome became battlefields where competing factions fought for control. As the gentle rhythm of this ancient story continues to unfold, we witness the emergence of larger-than-life figures whose ambitions and rivalries would reshape the Roman world. Gaius Marius, a novus homo from the countryside, revolutionized the Roman army while fighting Germanic tribes that threatened Italy from the north. His military reforms, creating professional legions recruited from the landless poor and bound to their commanders by oaths of personal loyalty, provided Rome with the most effective fighting force in the ancient world. Yet these same reforms undermined the citizen-soldier ideal that had sustained the Republic through its early centuries. Lucius Cornelius Sulla, Marius's former lieutenant and eventual rival, demonstrated the fragility of republican institutions when he marched his legions on Rome itself. The first Roman general to seize his own capital by force, Sulla used his victory to attempt a reactionary restoration of aristocratic power. His proscription lists, naming enemies to be killed and their property confiscated, introduced a level of systematic political violence that horrified even hardened Romans. Yet Sulla's ultimate retirement to private life, voluntarily giving up dictatorial power to tend his gardens and write his memoirs, showed that even the most ruthless Roman strongmen remained bound by traditional concepts of duty and propriety. The generation that followed Sulla's retirement produced 3 men whose rivalry would complete the destruction of the Republic. Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, Marcus Licinius Crassus, and Gaius Julius Caesar. Pompey earned his cognomen the Great through a series of spectacular military victories that extended Roman power from Spain to the Black Sea. His conquest of the East brought enormous wealth to Rome, while establishing him as the most celebrated general of his age. Crassus, the wealthiest man in Rome, used his financial resources to build a political network that rivaled Pompey's military achievements. Caesar, youngest of the three, combined intellectual brilliance with ruthless ambition, creating a popular following that complemented his colleagues' advantages. The first triumvirate, the secret alliance between these three titans, represented both the culmination of Republican politics and its transformation into something unprecedented. By coordinating their efforts and pooling their resources, Pompey, Crassus, and Caesar could override any opposition and accomplish virtually anything they desired. Yet their partnership was inherently unstable, for each man's ultimate goal was supreme power for himself rather than shared governance with his rivals. Caesar's conquest of Gaul, undertaken during his term as proconsul from 58 to 50 before our era, ranks among the greatest military achievements in human history. Leading his legions beyond the civilized world into the forests of Germania and across the narrow channel to mysterious Britain, Caesar not only extended Roman dominion to the Atlantic Ocean, but also demonstrated the tactical and strategic genius that would make him one of history's supreme commanders. His commentaries on the Gallic Wars, written in the third person with classical restraint, provide an invaluable record of ancient warfare while subtly promoting their author's reputation for courage, clemency, and competence. The death of Crassus at Carrhae in 53 before our era, where he and his army were destroyed by Parthian horse archers in the Syrian desert, upset the delicate balance of the triumvirate and set the stage for civil war between its surviving members. Pompey, backed by the conservative Senate, demanded that Caesar return to Rome as a private citizen to face charges related to his conduct in Gaul. Caesar, understanding that his political enemies would destroy him if he gave up his command and his armies, chose instead to cross the Rubicon River with a single legion, speaking the famous words, "The die is cast," as he committed himself to civil war. As the night deepens and this tale of ambition and conflict continues to unfold around you, imagine the mixture of excitement and terror that gripped the Roman world as Caesar's march on Rome began. The Republic that had endured for nearly 5 centuries, that had conquered the Mediterranean and brought unprecedented prosperity to the civilized world, seemed to be dissolving in the face of one man's refusal to accept the traditional limits of power. Yet Caesar's crossing of the Rubicon represented more than personal ambition. It embodied the contradictions that had been building within the Roman system for generations. The civil war between Caesar and Pompey was fought across the breadth of the Roman world, from Spain to Egypt, from Gaul to Africa. Caesar's veterans, bound to their commander by years of shared danger and mutual loyalty, proved superior to Pompey's more numerous but less experienced forces. The decisive battle at Pharsalus in 48 before our era saw Caesar defeat his former ally and colleague, though Pompey himself escaped to Egypt, where he was murdered by agents of the young pharaoh Ptolemy XIII. Caesar's subsequent adventures in Egypt, where he became the lover of Queen Cleopatra and nearly lost his life in the streets of Alexandria, demonstrated both his personal magnetism and his political acumen. His famous boast Veni Vidi Vici, after crushing the forces of Pharnaces at Zela, showed his ability to restore Roman prestige even while engaged in civil war. His clemency toward defeated opponents won him praise from contemporaries who had expected another round of sullen proscriptions, yet it also left potential enemies alive to conspire against him. The 4 years of Caesar's dictatorship, from 49 to 44 before our era, witnessed a series of reforms that addressed many of the problems that had plagued the late Republic. Caesar extended citizenship to Gauls and Spaniards, expanded the Senate to include representatives from throughout the Roman world, and undertook massive public works projects that provided employment for Rome's urban poor. His reform of the calendar, creating the Julian system that remained in use for centuries, exemplified his combination of practical wisdom and intellectual sophistication. Yet his increasingly monarchical behavior, his affair with the Egyptian queen, and his apparent plans to campaign against the Parthians aroused fears that he intended to establish a dynasty that would end Roman liberty forever. The assassination of Caesar on the Ides of March in 44 before our era, carried out by a conspiracy of senators led by Marcus Junius Brutus and Gaius Cassius Longinus, was intended to restore the Republic, but instead plunged Rome into another round of civil wars. The conspirators, calling themselves the Liberators, had planned Caesar's death but had made no provision for what would follow. Their assumption that the Republic would automatically revive once the dictator was removed proved tragically naive, for Caesar's removal created a power vacuum that could only be filled by force. Marcus Antonius, Caesar's loyal lieutenant and consul, used his control of Caesar's papers and funds to outmaneuver the assassins while building his own power base. The arrival in Rome of Gaius Octavius, Caesar's 18-year-old grandnephew and adopted heir, added another claimant to Caesar's legacy. The young man, who took the name Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus upon his adoption, possessed neither military experience nor political connections, yet he carried the magic of Caesar's name and the promise of his vast inheritance. As you drift deeper into this labyrinthine tale of Roman politics and warfare, consider the extraordinary circumstances that brought together the second triumvirate, Octavian, Antony, and Marcus Aemilius Lepidus. Unlike the secret alliance that had bound Pompey, Crassus, and Caesar, this partnership was formalized by law and recognized by the state. The triumvirs divided the Roman world among themselves while compiling proscription lists that surpassed even Sulla's in their ruthlessness. The greatest victim of these proscriptions was Marcus Tullius Cicero, the Republic's finest orator and Caesar's most eloquent opponent, whose severed head and hands were displayed on the rostra, where he had once delivered his greatest speeches. The defeat of the Republican armies at Philippi in 42 before our era marked the end of the Old Republic and the beginning of a new phase in Roman history. Brutus and Cassius, the last champions of traditional Roman liberty, died by their own hands rather than submit to their enemies. With their deaths, any hope of restoring the constitutional government of the past disappeared, leaving only the question of which strongman would ultimately emerge as sole ruler of the Roman world. The division of the Roman world between Octavian and Antony created an unstable duumvirate that could not long endure. Octavian, taking control of the West, devoted his energies to consolidating his power base in Italy while carefully maintaining the facade of republican government. Antony, ruling the wealthy East, became increasingly involved with Cleopatra and her dreams of restoring Ptolemaic greatness. Their rivalry, personal as much as political, played out against the backdrop of a Mediterranean world weary of civil war and longing for peace. The final act of the Roman Republic was performed at the naval battle of Actium in 31 before our era, where Octavian's fleet, commanded by his loyal friend Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa, defeated the combined forces of Antony and Cleopatra. The battle itself was less decisive than its aftermath, for Antony's defeat led to the collapse of his political position and the defection of his supporters. The subsequent suicides of Antony and Cleopatra in Alexandria marked the end of both the Ptolemaic dynasty and the last serious challenge to Octavian's supremacy. Octavian's return to Rome as the sole master of the Mediterranean world in 30 before our era began the transformation that would create the Roman Empire. Yet the young victor understood that he could not simply proclaim himself king without arousing the same opposition that had destroyed Caesar. Instead, he embarked on a careful process of constitutional settlement that preserved the forms of republican government while concentrating real power in his own hands. In 27 before our era, he formally restored the Republic, returning his extraordinary powers to the Senate and people of Rome, only to have them granted back to him with the new title of Augustus, the revered one. As the night continues to envelop you in its gentle embrace, let your mind wander through the transformation of Rome under Augustus. The man who had begun as Gaius Octavius, a sickly youth with no obvious qualifications for greatness, had become the architect of a new form of government that would endure for centuries. The Augustan settlement, as historians call his constitutional arrangements, created the framework of the Principate, a system in which the emperor ruled not as an absolute monarch, but as the first citizen of a restored republic. Augustus's genius lay in his understanding that Romans would accept monarchical power only if it was disguised as republican tradition. He held no office that had not existed under the Republic, yet his combination of proconsular imperium, tribunician power, and personal auctoritas gave him authority over every aspect of Roman life. The Senate continued to meet and debate, the consuls still held their ancient dignity, and the people still assembled to vote. But all real decisions were made in the emperor's palace on the Palatine Hill. The Pax Augusta, the Peace of Augustus, brought an end to the civil wars that had ravaged the Roman world for a century. Legions that had once fought each other were deployed to defend and extend the frontiers of the empire. The Praetorian Guard, elite soldiers stationed in Rome, provided security for the emperor while symbolizing the military basis of his power. Throughout the provinces, Roman governors appointed by Augustus brought order, justice, and prosperity to peoples who had known little of any of these blessings under the chaotic conditions of the late Republic. The cultural flowering of the Augustan age produced some of the greatest works in Latin literature. Publius Vigilius Maro, known to posterity as Virgil, composed the Aeneid, an epic poem that traced the mythical origins of Rome while celebrating Augustus as the fulfillment of divine destiny. Quintus Horatius Flaccus, called Horace, perfected the lyric poetry that would influence European literature for centuries. Publius Ovidius Naso, known as Ovid, created elegant verse that explored themes of love and transformation until his mysterious exile to the Black Sea shores. These poets, supported by wealthy patrons like Gaius Maecenas, created a golden age of literature that matched the political achievements of their time. The building program of Augustus transformed Rome from a city of brick into a city of marble. The Forum of Augustus, with its temple to Mars Ultor, celebrated both the emperor's victory over Caesar's assassins and his role as avenger of the Republic. The Theatre of Marcellus, the Baths of Agrippa, and countless other monuments demonstrated imperial generosity while providing employment for the urban masses. The Campus Martius was redesigned as a complex of temples, porticos, and gardens that served both religious and recreational purposes. Most symbolically, the Arapacis, the Altar of Peace, depicted Augustus and his family in a procession that embodied the harmony and prosperity of the new age. Augustus's family life, marked by personal tragedy and political necessity, illustrated the difficulties of establishing a hereditary succession in a state that still claimed to be a republic. His only child, Julia, became a tool of dynastic policy, married first to Marcus Claudius Marcellus, Augustus's nephew and heir apparent, then to Agrippa after Marcellus's untimely death, and finally to Tiberius Claudius Nero, Augustus's stepson. Her eventual exile for adultery reflected not only personal scandal, but also the impossible pressures placed on imperial women who were expected to embody both traditional Roman virtue and dynastic continuity. The death of Augustus in 14 of the Common Era, after a reign of 45 years, marked the first test of the imperial system he had created. His stepson Tiberius, a capable but reluctant heir, ascended to power through a combination of adoption, marriage alliances, and the elimination of other potential successors. The smooth transition of power demonstrated the stability of the Augustan settlement while establishing the precedent that the empire would be ruled by members of the Julian-Claudian dynasty. Tiberius's reign, lasting from 14 to 37, revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of the imperial system. A competent administrator and experienced general, he maintained the frontiers, balanced the budget, and preserved the peace that his stepfather had established. Yet his suspicious nature and eventual withdrawal to the island of Capri created a power vacuum in Rome that was filled by the ambitious and unscrupulous Praetorian prefect Lucius Aelius Sejanus. The rise and fall of Sejanus, who nearly succeeded in overthrowing the imperial family before his own execution, demonstrated the fragility of a system that depended so heavily on the character and vigilance of a single man. As you allow yourself to drift deeper into this flowing narrative of imperial succession and intrigue, consider the strange figure of Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus, known to history as Caligula, Little Boot, a nickname earned during his childhood among the legions of his father Germanicus. Caligula's accession to power in 37 was greeted with universal rejoicing, for he was the son of the beloved Germanicus and seemed to embody the military virtues that Romans admired. Yet, within months of taking power, serious illness, whether physical or mental, transformed him into a monster whose excesses shocked even a society accustomed to the arbitrary exercise of power. Caligula's brief reign of less than 4 years witnessed unprecedented displays of megalomania and cruelty. He declared himself a god and demanded worship from his subjects, built bridges across the Bay of Naples so that he could ride across them in imitation of Neptune, and appointed his horse Incitatus as consul. His sexual excesses, financial irresponsibility, and capricious violence created widespread opposition that culminated in his assassination by officers of the Praetorian Guard in 41. The fact that such a clearly unfit ruler could hold absolute power for nearly 4 years exposed the fundamental weakness of a system that provided no constitutional means for removing an incompetent emperor. The accession of Claudius, Caligula's uncle, demonstrated both the resilience of the imperial system and the continuing importance of the Praetorian Guard in determining succession. Found hiding behind a curtain in the palace after his nephew's assassination, Claudius was proclaimed emperor by the Praetorians who needed a Julian-Claudian figurehead to legitimize their coup. Contemporary sources, influenced by his physical disabilities and scholarly interests, portrayed Claudius as a weak ruler dominated by his wives and freedmen, yet modern historians recognize him as one of the most effective of the early emperors. Claudius's 13-year reign witnessed significant expansion of the empire, most notably the conquest of Britain in 43. The invasion of the mysterious island beyond the edge of the world, attempted by Caesar but never completed, demonstrated Roman determination to push the boundaries of civilization ever outward. Aulus Plautius and his legions crossed the Channel in the footsteps of Caesar's earlier expeditions, but this time they came to stay. The establishment of Roman rule in Britain, though never extending to the entire island, brought the wealth of British mines and the prestige of conquering new peoples to enhance imperial glory. The domestic policies of Claudius reflected his scholarly understanding of Roman history and his practical appreciation of administrative necessity. He extended citizenship more generously than his predecessors, famously arguing in the Senate that Rome's greatness had always depended on her willingness to incorporate worthy foreigners into the citizen body. His public works program included new aqueducts, the draining of the Fucine Lake, and the construction of a new harbour at Ostia that secured Rome's grain supply from Egypt and Africa. His legal reforms clarified the status of slaves and freedmen while establishing procedures that would influence Roman jurisprudence for centuries. The personal life of Claudius, marked by a series of disastrous marriages, illustrated the continuing problems of imperial succession. His third wife, Valeria Messalina, became notorious for her sexual excesses and political conspiracies, eventually forcing Claudius to order her execution when she went through a marriage ceremony with another man, while still wed to the emperor. His fourth wife, Agrippina the Younger, was the sister of Caligula and mother of Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, later known as Nero. Agrippina's ambition to place her son on the throne led to Claudius's death by poison in 54, though whether she was responsible remains one of the great mysteries of imperial history. Nero's accession at the age of 16, guided by his tutor Lucius Annaeus Seneca and the Praetorian prefect Sextus Afranius Burrus, began promisingly with a series of moderate and popular policies. The young emperor, trained in rhetoric and philosophy, seemed to embody the cultured ideals of the age, while his advisors provided the practical wisdom needed to govern the empire effectively. Yet the corruption that absolute power brought to his character became apparent as he matured, leading to increasingly erratic and tyrannical behavior that would ultimately destroy both his dynasty and his reputation. The early years of Nero's reign, often called the Quinquennium Neronis, represented a golden age of imperial administration. Seneca's philosophical principles and Burrus's military experience created a balanced government that respected traditional forms while addressing contemporary needs. The emperor's artistic interests, though later condemned as undignified, initially provided a welcome contrast to the military preoccupations of his predecessors. His public recitations of poetry, his performances on the stage, and his passion for chariot racing reflected a cosmopolitan culture that embraced Greek as well as Roman traditions. As the night continues to unfold around you like a gentle tide, let your mind drift through the tragic transformation of Nero from promising youth to despotic monster. The murder of his mother Agrippina in 59, orchestrated through an elaborate plot involving a collapsible boat designed to drown her during a pleasure cruise, marked the beginning of his descent into paranoid tyranny. When the boat failed to kill her and she swam to shore, Nero sent assassins to complete the deed, crossing a line that even Roman politics had rarely breached. The matricide shocked contemporary society and began the process that would ultimately cost Nero both his throne and his life. The Great Fire of Rome in 64, which destroyed large sections of the city and created thousands of refugees, provided both an opportunity and a challenge for Nero's administration. Contrary to the famous legend that he fiddled while Rome burned, Nero was actually in Antiae when the fire began and hurried back to organize relief efforts. His decision to rebuild the city according to a comprehensive urban plan, with wider streets, fire-resistant materials, and better access to water, demonstrated sound administrative judgment. Yet his construction of the enormous Domus Aurea, a palace complex that covered much of central Rome, aroused resentment among citizens who had lost their homes in the fire. The persecution of Christians that followed the fire, intended to deflect blame from the emperor himself, introduced a new element of religious conflict into Roman society. The Christians, a small but growing sect that refused to participate in the traditional religious observances that bound the empire together, provided convenient scapegoats for popular anger over the disaster. Their execution in the arena, where they were torn apart by wild animals or burned alive as human torches to illuminate Nero's gardens, created the first Christian martyrs while establishing a precedent for religious persecution that would periodically surface throughout imperial history. Nero's artistic pretensions, which led him to tour Greece as a performer and compete in the Olympic Games, violated Roman concepts of imperial dignity while revealing his fundamental misunderstanding of his role as emperor. His victories in competitions where no one dared defeat him, His emotional performances of tragic roles, and his collection of more than 1,800 crowns for various artistic achievements became subjects of ridicule and disgust among the traditional Roman elite. The emperor's absence from Rome for extended periods while pursuing his artistic career left the government in the hands of freedmen and favourites whose corruption and incompetence further weakened his position. The revolt of Gaius Julius Vindex in Gaul in 68, though quickly suppressed by loyal legions, demonstrated that Nero's authority was not unshakable. More seriously, the defection of Servius Sulpicius Galba, the elderly governor of Hispania Tarraconensis, provided a focal point for opposition to Nero's rule. When the Praetorian Guard and the Senate declared Galba emperor and condemned Nero as a public enemy, the last of the Julian-Claudian dynasty found himself abandoned by all except a few faithful slaves. His suicide in a suburban villa, accompanied by the melodramatic words, "What an artist dies in me," ended the first imperial dynasty and plunged Rome into a year of civil war. The year of the four emperors, 69 of the Common Era, witnessed the rapid succession of Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and Vespasian, demonstrating both the fragility of imperial authority and the continued importance of military force in determining political succession. Galba's brief reign of 7 months ended when he was murdered by supporters of Marcus Salvius Otho, who had expected to be adopted as heir but was passed over in favour of Lucius Calpurnius Piso Licinianus. Otho's own reign lasted only 3 months before he was defeated and killed by the armies of Aulus Vitellius, whose supporters had proclaimed him emperor in Germany. Vitellius held power for 8 months before falling to Titus Flavius Vespasianus, a general who had been conducting the siege of Jerusalem when he learned of his own proclamation as emperor by the Eastern legions. Vespasian's victory and the establishment of the Flavian dynasty brought stability to an empire that had seemed on the verge of disintegration. A practical man from an Italian municipal family, Vespasian embodied the bourgeois virtues that Augustus had tried to restore while avoiding the aristocratic pretensions that had corrupted his predecessors. His famous deathbed jest, "I think I'm becoming a god," revealed both his sense of humour and his realistic understanding of the imperial position. His restoration of imperial finances, damaged by Nero's extravagances and the civil wars, demonstrated the administrative competence that would characterize his dynasty. The completion of the conquest of Britain under Vespasian and his sons brought Roman civilization to the furthest reaches of the known world. Gnaeus Julius Agricola, whose campaigns were recorded by his son-in-law Tacitus, extended Roman control into the Scottish Highlands and defeated the Caledonian tribes at Mons Graupius. Though political considerations prevented the complete conquest of Scotland, Roman influence spread throughout Britain through the establishment of cities, roads, and fortifications that brought Mediterranean civilization to Celtic tribes that had never known urban life. As you drift deeper into this ancient tale of conquest and administration, consider the great construction projects that marked Vespasian's reign and demonstrated the restored prosperity of the empire. The Flavian amphitheatre, known to later ages as the Colosseum, rose on the site of Nero's artificial lake, symbolically reclaiming public space from imperial luxury. This massive structure, capable of holding 50,000 spectators, became the site of gladiatorial games and wild beast hunts that entertained the Roman people while demonstrating imperial power and generosity. The Temple of Peace, built to commemorate the end of the Jewish War, housed treasures looted from Jerusalem's temple, while proclaiming Rome's victory over all who dared resist her authority. The reign of Titus, Vespasian's elder son, though lasting only 2 years from 79 to 81, witnessed some of the most memorable events in Roman history. The eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79, which buried Pompeii and Herculaneum under volcanic ash and pumice, provided future archaeologists with an unparalleled glimpse into daily life in a Roman city while demonstrating the emperor's compassionate response to natural disaster. Titus's personal involvement in relief efforts, his generous financial assistance to survivors, and his decision to complete the Colosseum and open it with magnificent games that lasted 100 days earned him the title, the delight of the human race. The brief reign of Titus was followed by the longer and more controversial rule of his younger brother Domitian, whose 15-year reign from 81 to 96 marked both the height of Flavian achievement and the dynasty's ultimate failure. Domitian's military campaigns on the Rhine and Danube frontiers demonstrated Roman determination to maintain security, while his building program in Rome rivaled that of Augustus in its scope and magnificence. The completion of the Flavian Palace on the Palatine Hill created a complex of state apartments and private quarters that would serve as the imperial residence for centuries, while his reconstruction of the Circus Maximus and other public buildings enhanced the capital's grandeur. Yet Domitian's increasingly autocratic behavior and his insistence on divine honors alienated the Senate and created the atmosphere of fear and suspicion that characterized his later years. His persecution of philosophers and his execution of senators on charges of treason or atheism recalled the worst excesses of Caligula and Nero, while his demand to be addressed as Lord and God violated the careful balance between imperial power and republican tradition that Augustus had established. The conspiracy that ended his life in 96 was organized by court officials and freedmen who feared for their own safety rather than by senators seeking to restore constitutional government. The assassination of Domitian and the accession of Marcus Cocceius Nerva marked the beginning of what historians call the adoptive emperors, a series of rulers who chose their successors based on merit rather than blood relationship. Nerva, an elderly senator with no military experience and no natural heirs, faced immediate challenges from the Praetorian Guard and provincial armies that questioned his authority. His adoption of Marcus Ulpius Trajanus, the governor of Upper Germany, provided the military backing he needed, while establishing the principle that the empire should be ruled by the most qualified candidate, regardless of family connections. Trajan's accession in 98 began what contemporary sources called the happiest period in human history, an age when the Roman Empire reached its greatest territorial extent while enjoying unprecedented prosperity and internal peace. Born in Spain to a family of Italian colonists, Trajan represented the success of Roman civilization in integrating provincial elites into the imperial system. His military campaigns in Dacia, fought between 101 and 106, brought enormous wealth to Rome while eliminating a dangerous enemy on the Danube frontier. The gold and silver of the Dacian mines financed public works projects throughout the empire, while the enslavement of hundreds of thousands of Dacians provided labor for Roman estates and workshops. The Dacian Wars, immortalized in the spiral reliefs of Trajan's column, demonstrated both the effectiveness of Roman military organization and the cultural significance of imperial expansion. The column itself, rising 125 feet above Trajan's Forum, told the story of the campaigns in detailed sculptural narrative while serving as the emperor's tomb. The surrounding forum, built with Dacian gold and designed by the architect Apollodorus of Damascus, created a complex of basilicas, libraries and markets that served as both a commercial center and a monument to imperial achievement. As the night deepens around you, and this ancient narrative continues to unfold, let your mind wander through Trajan's eastern campaigns, which brought Roman legions to the banks of the Tigris River and temporarily extended the empire to its greatest geographical extent. The conquest of Armenia, the client kingdom that had long served as a buffer between Rome and Persia, marked the beginning of an ambitious attempt to solve the Eastern question through direct annexation rather than diplomatic manipulation. The subsequent campaigns in Mesopotamia, though initially successful in capturing the Parthian capital of Ctesiphon, ultimately proved impossible to sustain due to the vast distances involved and the difficulty of maintaining supply lines across hostile territory. The Jewish revolt that began in 115, spreading from Cyrenaica to Cyprus to Egypt to Mesopotamia, revealed the continuing tensions between Roman authority and Jewish religious identity that had never been fully resolved since the destruction of Jerusalem in 70. The ferocity of the fighting, which reportedly claimed hundreds of thousands of lives on both sides, demonstrated that Roman tolerance of local customs had limits when those customs conflicted with imperial interests. The suppression of the revolt required the deployment of legions from across the empire and left lasting scars on the relationship between Rome and her Jewish subjects. Trajan's death in 117, while returning from his eastern campaigns, brought to power his kinsman and adopted son Publius Aelius Hadrianus, a man whose intellectual interests and administrative abilities would reshape the empire's approach to defense and governance. Hadrian's immediate decision to abandon Trajan's eastern conquests and withdraw to more defensible frontiers demonstrated both strategic wisdom and political courage, for he risked being seen as weak by those who had celebrated his predecessor's victories. His travels throughout the empire, which occupied much of his 21-year reign, reflected a new conception of imperial duty that emphasized personal inspection and local adaptation rather than expansion and conquest. The most famous monument of Hadrian's reign, the wall that bears his name across northern Britain, symbolized the empire's transition from expansion to consolidation. Stretching 73 miles from the Solway Firth to the mouth of the Tyne River, Hadrian's Wall represented both a military fortification and a cultural boundary, separating the civilized Roman province from the barbarian tribes of Caledonia. The wall's construction, requiring the labor of 3 legions over several years, demonstrated Roman engineering expertise while providing employment for auxiliary troops drawn from across the empire. Hadrian's cultural interests, particularly his passion for Greek philosophy and art, influenced imperial policy while reflecting the cosmopolitan character of the 2nd century empire. His rebuilding of the Pantheon in Rome, with its revolutionary concrete dome and oculus open to the sky, created one of the architectural masterpieces of the ancient world, while demonstrating the technical capabilities that Roman engineers had developed. His foundation of Antinoepolis in Egypt, named for his beloved companion Antinous, who drowned in the Nile, revealed both his personal grief and his commitment to Hellenistic culture. The Bar Kokhba revolt in Judea from 132 to 135 marked the final and most destructive phase of Jewish resistance to Roman rule. Simon Bar Kokhba, proclaimed as the Messiah by the influential Rabbi Akiva, succeeded in establishing an independent Jewish state that lasted for 3 years and controlled much of Palestine. The revolt's suppression required the deployment of legions from across the empire under the personal command of Julius Severus, one of Rome's most capable generals. The war's end saw the destruction of Jerusalem, the prohibition of Jewish residence in the city, and the establishment of Aelia Capitolina as a Roman colony on the site of the ancient capital. Hadrian's adoption of Titus Aurelius Fulvus, Boionius Arius Antoninus, who would rule as Antoninus Pius from 138 to 161, ensured the continuity of the adoptive system while bringing to power a man whose reign would be remembered for its peace and prosperity. Antoninus Pius, whose cognomen reflected his devotion to duty and family, never left Italy during his 23-year reign, governing the empire through correspondence and delegation while maintaining the Pax Romana through diplomatic skill rather than military force. His reign marked the high point of Roman administrative efficiency when provincial governors were chosen for their competence rather than their connections, and when justice was dispensed according to established legal principles rather than imperial whim. The cultural flowering of the Antonine period produced some of the greatest achievements in Roman art, architecture, and literature. The column of Antoninus Pius, though less famous than Trajan's monument, demonstrated continuing imperial commitment to public magnificence, while the expansion of Roman citizenship to increasing numbers of provincials reflected the empire's success in creating a unified Mediterranean civilization. Legal scholars like Gaius and Ulpian developed the systematic jurisprudence that would influence European law for centuries, while Greek intellectuals like Plutarch and Dio Chrysostom found Roman patronage for their literary and philosophical works. As you allow yourself to drift even deeper into this flowing narrative of imperial grandeur and cultural achievement, consider the reign of Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor whose meditations would inspire countless generations while his military campaigns defended the empire against increasingly dangerous barbarian threats. Marcus Aurelius, adopted by Antoninus Pius and trained from youth for imperial responsibility, ascended to power in 161 with a deep understanding of both Stoic philosophy and practical administration. His decision to share power with his adoptive brother Lucius Verus, creating the first joint emperorship in Roman history, reflected both personal loyalty and recognition that the empire had grown too large for effective rule by a single individual. The Parthian War that began immediately upon Marcus Aurelius's accession tested both the new emperor's administrative abilities and the empire's military resources. Lucius Verus's campaigns in Armenia and Mesopotamia, though ultimately successful in restoring Roman prestige in the east, came at an enormous cost in both money and manpower. More seriously, the armies returning from the east brought with them a plague that devastated the empire for nearly 2 decades, killing perhaps 10% of the population and weakening Roman society just as barbarian pressure on the frontiers was increasing. The Marcomannic Wars, fought along the Danube frontier from 166 to 180, marked the beginning of the barbarian invasions that would eventually overwhelm the Western Empire. Germanic tribes, pressed by population growth and by the westward movement of other peoples, launched coordinated attacks that penetrated deep into Roman territory. Marcus Aurelius, despite his preference for philosophical contemplation, spent the last years of his life on campaign, personally leading Roman armies against the Marcomanni, Quadi, and other Germanic confederations. His death at Vindobona in 180, while preparing for what he hoped would be the final campaign against the barbarians, marked the end of the Pax Romana and the beginning of a more troubled age. The accession of Commodus, Marcus Aurelius's natural son, ended the adoptive system and restored hereditary succession with disastrous results. Commodus, lacking both his father's philosophical temperament and his administrative abilities, preferred the arena to the council chamber and gladiatorial combat to the responsibilities of government. His reign of 12 years witnessed the gradual breakdown of the administrative system that had governed the empire effectively for nearly a century, as favoritism and corruption replaced merit and competence in the selection of officials. The megalomania that characterized Commodus's later years recalled the worst excesses of Caligula and Nero, while his identification with Hercules and his participation in gladiatorial games violated the dignity that Romans expected from their rulers. His renaming of Rome as Commodiana and his plan to appear as a gladiator at the New Year Games of 193 finally provoked the conspiracy that ended his life. His assassination on New Year's Eve, 1922, plunged the empire into another civil war and marked the beginning of the crisis that would dominate the 3rd century. The year of the 5 emperors, in 1933, saw the rapid succession of Pertinax, Didius Julianus, Pescennius Niger, Clodius Albinus, and Septimius Severus, demonstrating that the military bases of imperial power had not changed despite 2 centuries of constitutional development. Septimius Severus, the ultimate victor in this struggle, established a new dynasty while transforming the empire into a more openly military state. His advice to his sons, enrich the soldiers and despise everyone else, revealed both his understanding of political reality and the fundamental change that had occurred in the relationship between the emperor and his subjects. The Severan dynasty, ruling from 193 to 235, presided over the empire's final period of expansion and prosperity, while introducing changes that would ultimately prove destructive to imperial unity. Septimius Severus's extension of citizenship to virtually all free inhabitants of the empire through the Constitutio Antoniniana of 212 completed the process of Romanization while creating new sources of tax revenue. Yet his expansion of the army and his reliance on barbarian auxiliaries strained imperial finances while introducing Germanic cultural elements into Roman military tradition. The reign of Severus Alexander, the last of the Severan emperors, ended in 235 when he and his mother were murdered by mutinous soldiers who proclaimed Maximinus Thrax as emperor. This event marked the beginning of the crisis of the 3rd century, a 50-year period of political chaos, economic collapse, and military disaster that nearly destroyed the Roman Empire. During these 5 decades, more than 50 men claimed imperial titles, while barbarian invasions, civil wars, and plague reduced the empire to a shadow of its former greatness. As the gentle rhythm of this ancient story continues to unfold around you, consider the extraordinary challenges that faced the empire during this dark period. The Persian Sassanid dynasty, which had replaced the Parthians in the 200s and 20s, proved far more aggressive and militarily capable than their predecessors, capturing Roman territories in Mesopotamia and even taking the Emperor Valerian prisoner in 260. Gothic and other Germanic tribes crossed the Danube in massive migrations, establishing kingdoms within former Roman territory, while other barbarian groups raided as far south as Greece and Asia Minor. The economy, undermined by debased currency and disrupted trade routes, struggled to support the military forces needed to defend the empire's vast frontiers. The nadir of imperial fortunes came in the 260s, when the empire effectively split into 3 parts: the Gallic Empire, established by Postumus in the west, the Palmyrene Empire created by Zenobia in the east, and the Rump Roman Empire centered on Italy and the Balkans. The Empress Zenobia of Palmyra, claiming to rule as regent for her infant son, established control over Egypt, Syria, and much of Asia Minor while styling herself as a new Cleopatra and champion of Eastern culture against Roman domination. Her court at Palmyra attracted Greek philosophers and Eastern mystics, while her armies challenged Roman authority from the Euphrates to the Nile. The restoration of imperial unity began with Claudius Gothicus, who earned his cognomen by defeating a massive Gothic invasion in 269, and continued under Aurelian, whose energy and military skill earned him the title Restorer of the World. Aurelian's reconquest of the Palmyrene Empire in 272 and the Gallic Empire in 274 demonstrated that Roman military superiority could still triumph over barbarian valor and provincial separatism. Yet his construction of new walls around Rome itself revealed the fundamentally changed strategic situation that required the capital to be fortified against barbarian attack. The reforms of Diocletian, who ruled from 284 to 305, addressed the underlying causes of the 3rd century crisis while transforming the empire into something fundamentally different from the principate established by Augustus. The Tetrarchy, Diocletian's system of 4 co-emperors ruling different regions of the empire, recognized that the Roman world had grown too large and complex for effective rule by a single individual. His division of civil and military authority, his creation of a new administrative hierarchy, and his establishment of fixed capitals at Nicomedia, Milan, Trier, and Sirmium mark the beginning of the late empire that would endure for another 2 centuries in the west and more than a millennium in the east. Diocletian's economic reforms including the Edict on Maximum Prices and the establishment of a new gold currency, attempted to address the inflation and monetary chaos that had plagued the empire since the early 3rd century. His tax reforms, based on regular censuses and standardized assessments, provided a more reliable source of revenue, while his expansion of the bureaucracy created a professional administrative class that could implement imperial policy throughout the provinces. Yet these reforms came at the cost of personal freedom and social mobility, as Diocletian's government attempted to bind peasants to the land and craftsmen to their trades in order to ensure tax collection and military recruitment. The Great Persecution launched by Diocletian in 303 represented the empire's final attempt to suppress Christianity through systematic violence. The edict ordering the destruction of churches, the burning of scriptures, and the arrest of clergy marked the culmination of centuries of intermittent persecution, while revealing the emperor's recognition that Christianity had become too powerful to ignore. Yet the persecution's ultimate failure, demonstrated by Constantine's conversion less than a decade later, showed that the empire could no longer maintain religious unity through coercion. As you drift deeper into this tale of transformation and renewal, let your mind encompass the extraordinary changes that occurred during Constantine's reign from 306 to 337. The Battle of the Milvian Bridge in 312, where Constantine defeated his rival Maxentius after reportedly seeing a vision of the Christian cross in the sky, marked not only his victory in the civil wars that followed Diocletian's abdication, but also the beginning of Christianity's transformation from a persecuted sect to the empire's favoured religion. The Edict of Milan in 313, which granted religious tolerance to all inhabitants of the empire, ended 3 centuries of Christian persecution while establishing the principle of religious freedom under imperial law. Constantine's foundation of Constantinople in 330, built on the site of the ancient Greek city of Byzantium, created a new Rome that would outlast the original by more than 1,000 years. The city's location on the Bosphorus gave it control over trade routes between Europe and Asia, while its magnificent churches and palaces demonstrated imperial commitment to Christian civilization. The Hagia Sophia, though built by a later emperor, would embody the architectural synthesis of Roman engineering and Christian symbolism that characterized the new capital. The Council of Nicaea in 325, convened by Constantine to address disputes over Christian doctrine, demonstrated the emperor's role as protector of church unity while establishing precedents for imperial involvement in religious affairs that would influence both Eastern and Western Christianity for centuries. The Nicene Creed, formulated at this council, provided a statement of Orthodox Christian belief that became the foundation of both Catholic and Orthodox theology, while the council's proceedings revealed the complex relationship between imperial authority and ecclesiastical independence. Constantine's administrative and military reforms continued the transformation begun by Diocletian while creating new institutions that would characterize the late empire. The establishment of the Palatine offices, staffed by educated bureaucrats rather than military commanders, professionalized imperial administration while creating opportunities for social advancement based on education rather than birth. The creation of new units of heavy cavalry influenced by Persian and Germanic military practices reflected the changing nature of warfare, while the expansion of the limitanae, frontier armies recruited locally and settled on borderlands, addressed the empire's chronic manpower shortages. The death of Constantine in 337 and the subsequent division of the empire among his 3 sons marked the beginning of a new phase in imperial history, characterized by frequent civil wars and increasing barbarian pressure. The brief reign of Julian the Apostate from 361 to 363, during which he attempted to restore traditional Roman religion while maintaining Christian tolerance, demonstrated both the resilience of paganism and the impossibility of reversing the Christianization process. Julian's death in battle against the Persians ended the last serious attempt to restore the old gods, while his Persian campaign revealed the continuing drain that Eastern warfare placed on imperial resources. The reigns of Valentinian Romulus in the west and Valens in the east, from 364 to 378, witnessed both successful defense against barbarian invasions and catastrophic military defeats that foreshadowed the empire's eventual collapse. Valentinian's fortification of the Rhine frontier and his campaigns against the Alemanni demonstrated Roman determination to maintain territorial integrity, while his legal reforms protecting the rights of ordinary citizens revealed continued commitment to justice and good government. Yet Valens's defeat and death at Adrianople in 378, where a Roman army was destroyed by Gothic cavalry, marked a turning point in the relationship between Rome and the barbarian peoples who increasingly dominated imperial military affairs. Theodosius I, the last emperor to rule both East and West, spent much of his reign from 379 to 395 dealing with the consequences of Adrianople, while establishing policies that would shape the empire's final centuries. His settlement with the Gothic tribes, granting them federate status within the empire in exchange for military service, created precedents for the integration of barbarian peoples that would ultimately transform Roman society. His establishment of Catholic Christianity as the empire's official religion through the Edict of Thessalonica in 380 completed the Christianization process while creating new conflicts with pagans, Jews, and heretical Christians. The division of the empire between Theodosius's sons Arcadius and Honorius in 395 marked the beginning of the final phase of imperial history in the West. Though the division was intended to be temporary, the two halves of the empire never again came under unified rule, and their divergent fates illustrated the different challenges facing the eastern and western provinces. The Eastern Empire, with its secure capital at Constantinople and its wealthy provinces in Asia Minor and Egypt, would survive for another 1,000 years as the Byzantine Empire. The Western Empire, weakened by barbarian invasions, civil wars, and economic decline, had less than a century remaining. As the night continues to envelop you in its gentle embrace, let your thoughts drift through the twilight years of the Western Empire, when great figures struggled against impossible odds to preserve the legacy of Rome. Stilicho, the Vandal general who served as regent for the young Emperor Honorius, won several brilliant victories against barbarian invaders while attempting to maintain imperial unity against increasing centrifugal forces. His execution in 408, ordered by the paranoid Honorius on charges of treason, removed the empire's most capable defender and opened the way for the sack of Rome itself. The sack of Rome by Alaric and his Visigothic army in 410 shocked the Mediterranean world and marked the end of the city's claim to inviolability. Though Alaric's occupation lasted only 3 days and was relatively restrained by ancient standards, the psychological impact of barbarians occupying the eternal city reverberated throughout the civilized world. St. Augustine's City of God, written partly in response to pagan claims that Rome's conversion to Christianity had brought divine punishment, provided a Christian interpretation of history that would influence medieval thought for centuries. The gradual transformation of the Western Empire during the 5th century saw barbarian kingdoms established within former Roman territories, while imperial authority retreated to ever smaller enclaves. The Visigothic kingdom in Spain and southern Gaul, the Vandal kingdom in North Africa, the Burgundian kingdom in the Rhone Valley, and various Anglo-Saxon kingdoms in Britain represented not conquest in the traditional sense, but rather the settlement of federate peoples who maintained nominal allegiance to Rome while exercising practical independence. These kingdoms preserved many Roman institutions and customs while adapting them to Germanic legal traditions and social structures. The career of Aetius, the last of the great Roman generals, illustrated both the possibilities and limitations of imperial policy in the 5th century, who earned his epithet, the last Roman, for his heroic efforts to preserve the empire against overwhelming odds. His victory over Attila and the Huns at the Battle of the Catalonian Plains in 451, fought alongside Visigothic allies, saved Gaul from complete devastation, and demonstrated that Roman military genius could still achieve triumphs even in an age of decline. Yet Aetius's murder in 454, ordered by the paranoid Emperor Valentinian III, who feared his general's power, removed the last effective defender of the Western Empire. The final decades of the Western Roman Empire were characterized by a rapid succession of weak emperors, often mere puppets of powerful barbarian generals who controlled the real levers of power. Ricimer, a Suebian general, made and unmade emperors for nearly 2 decades, demonstrating that the imperial title had become an empty shell without military backing. The economic collapse of the Western provinces, the loss of tax revenues from wealthy regions like North Africa, and the continued strain of maintaining a large army against relentless barbarian pressure, all contributed to the empire's terminal decline. As the night continues to envelop you in its gentle embrace, let your mind drift through the final, quiet saga of the Roman Empire in the West. The deposition of Romulus Augustulus in 476 by the Germanic chieftain Odoacer is traditionally regarded as the end of the Western Roman Empire. The young emperor, whose name ironically combined the founder of Rome with its first emperor, was sent into comfortable exile, and Odoacer sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople, acknowledging the Eastern emperor as the sole legitimate ruler. This event, though hardly noticed by contemporaries, marked the formal end of a political entity that had endured for more than 1,000 years. Yet the legacy of Rome did not end with the fall of its Western Empire. The Eastern Roman Empire, known to historians as the Byzantine Empire, continued to flourish for another 1,000 years, preserving Roman law, Greek philosophy, and Christian theology while facing new challenges from Persia and the rising power of Islam. In the West, the barbarian kingdoms that replaced Roman rule built on Roman foundations, adopting Latin as the language of administration and the Roman legal system as the basis for their own laws. The Catholic Church, with its hierarchical structure and its network of bishops, preserved much of Roman culture and learning through the chaos of the early Middle Ages. The ghost of Rome continued to haunt the imagination of Europe for centuries. Charlemagne, crowned emperor in 800, attempted to revive the Western Empire, and later rulers of the Holy Roman Empire claimed a direct descent from Augustus and Constantine. Roman law, codified by the Emperor Justinian in the 6th century, was rediscovered in the 11th century and formed the basis for legal systems across Europe. Roman architectural forms, from the arch to the dome, were imitated and adapted by builders for millennia, and the Latin language, though no longer spoken as a living tongue, became the language of scholarship, science, and the church. As you drift deeper into the profound stillness of this ancient tale, consider the enduring impact of Rome on the world. The concepts of citizenship, law, and republican government, though transformed over time, trace their origins to the city on the Tiber. The roads and aqueducts that crisscross the empire, though now in ruins, stand as testaments to Roman engineering genius. The literature, philosophy, and art of Rome and Greece, preserved and transmitted through Roman hands, shaped the intellectual and aesthetic landscape of the West. The story of the Roman Empire is not simply a tale of rise and fall, of conquest and decline. It is a story of human ambition and ingenuity, of virtue and vice, of the ceaseless struggle to build and maintain order in a chaotic world. It is the story of how a small city-state grew to encompass an entire world, and how its legacy continues to shape our own world even today. As the night deepens around you and the echoes of ancient Rome fade into the quiet, let your mind rest, knowing that the eternal city, though fallen, lives on in the institutions, languages, and ideas that define our civilization. The legions are silent, the emperors sleep, but the story of Rome, like the Tiber itself, flows on forever.